Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in my 2 terms in this honorable House, I can't recall having heard a more incoherent, unintelligent, disjointed, broken, loose, and at times disparaging contribution than what I just heard from the member for Castries Southeast, sorry, Mr. Speaker. And so, Mr. Speaker, I am caught in a quandary as to whether, Mr. Speaker, I respond to some of the things he said and actually dignify his contribution with a response. Mr. Speaker, all of what he said here today are things we would have heard from him in the past. He was incoherent and disjointed in the sense that when he started off, he alluded to promises made by the Labour Party. And for him it was jobs, jobs, jobs. Then he left the jobs chorus. And he said that we are where we are at today because of COVID, and nobody saw COVID coming. Then in terms of where we are at today, Mr. Speaker, it was no longer COVID. But he said that the Labour Party, because of its mismanagement of the economy of St. Lucia, was responsible for where we are at today. So 1 minute, it is the unforeseen challenges of COVID, and on another hand, Mr. Speaker, it is mismanagement of the economy by the St. Lucia Labour Party. Seabed, jobs, 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 DWE, etc., Mr. Speaker. And frankly, Mr. Speaker, in the time allotted to me, I will not respond to the claims made by the member for Castries Southeast. As I said, these are things we would have heard before, not once, not twice, but on many, many occasions prior. And at times, Mr. Speaker, I believe, in as much as the debate has to be spirited, I always have an issue when the debate begins to take a tone where it can be deemed disparaging. I will not repeat what he said about the leader of the opposition and member for Castries East. Mr. Speaker, it is always a pleasure for me to emerge from the banana fields of the Mabuya Valley, traverse the Battle Hill, and take my rightful place in this honorable House on behalf of the people of Dennery North, who continue to repose their confidence in my ability to give expression to their concerns, Mr. Speaker. And when I come here, Mr. Speaker, I always attempt as much as possible to make an honest and objective contribution to debates irrespective of what matter is before the Parliament. Mr. Speaker, nobody saw COVID-19 coming. And I've said here before, and other members have alluded to that as well, that COVID-19 has proven to be a game changer, not just for small island developing states like St. Lucia, but for countries the world over, Mr. Speaker. And with COVID come challenges. And the Prime Minister, in presenting the resolution this morning, said that the challenges, to paraphrase, can be categorized or can be placed in 2 major categories. They can be of a health and wellness nature, and the challenges can be of an economic nature, Mr. Speaker. And so today, we are here, another sitting, and another set of borrowing. And what concerns me here today, Mr. Speaker, is not just the frequency with which we come to the Honorable House to borrow, but also the quantum and the purpose for which we are borrowing. Different administrations will have different priorities. And political parties, when they assume office, will have approaches to tackling the problems of the country in ways that they deem would be most appropriate given the times that we're living in. So, in as much as it is the prerogative of the Prime Minister and his cabinet to come to the Parliament to borrow, Mr. Speaker, the opposition, as I've said in here time and again, we have a responsibility, and no amount of labels or disparaging remarks ascribed to us will cause us, Mr. Speaker, will cause us to neglect the responsibilities that we have as duly elected members of the Parliament. Mr. Speaker, we have a responsibility to provide an alternative view. We have a responsibility to ask the government to put checks and balances in place. And Mr. Speaker, I believe there are times when our contributions are not valued for what they are. I honestly believe that every one of the 17 members in this Parliament mean well when we come in here to deliberate on matters of national importance and national development. And so we heard the debates this morning about the country's debt situation. But what triggers debt? Why do governments borrow? One of the main reasons why governments borrow, Mr. Speaker, is that they are not able to raise sufficient revenue to execute the programs that they would have planned for the citizens of the country. And one other reason, or the other reason, in my opinion, for which governments borrow, Mr. Speaker, is to deal with unanticipated events, unforeseen circumstances, things that just pop up, hurricanes, floods, disasters generally, Mr. Speaker. And sometimes, for small island developing states like St. Lucia, you are forced to borrow because something has happened so far away. But because of our open economy, Mr. Speaker, and lack of resources, we cannot withstand the shocks of events that may happen thousands of miles away. And so we are forced to go to lending institutions to ask them for money to deal with situations in our country. So borrowing is a must. But even as you borrow, Mr. Speaker, you must do that responsibly. Mr. Speaker, je veux dire que le gouvernement a prêté l'argent pour deux raisons. Le gouvernement n'a pas fait assez d'argent pour développer avec ces programmes-là, il voulait les pays. Et puis là, le gouvernement a aussi prêté l'argent. Puis ce bagage a fait de manière qui s'y bite. Le gouvernement n'a pas qu'à venir extérieur pour prêter l'argent pour ranger le pays. Bagage comme hurricane, bagage comme floods et puis natural disasters. Et quand petit pays comme cette ici, Mr. Speaker, quand nous pas ni un shy resources, dès les bagages qu'a fait dans un gros pays comme l'Angleterre, l'Amérique, et que laisse ces bagages ça l'a fait, il a affecté nous en manière, nous pas de jamais quoi, nous te taper affecté. And so, these reasons, Mr. Speaker, ought to be the basis on which government would borrow money. Today, before the Parliament, the government has come for a loan of 54 million EC dollars. It is a short-term loan, Mr. Speaker, from what we can see. It's not a commercial loan. I don't think the loan is developmental in nature, but it is really money that will be spent, or is supposed to be spent, to provide relief to people who would have been affected by the COVID pandemic. The money is being sourced from a Taiwanese bank. And to date, Mr. Speaker, subject to correction, the government of St. Lucia has borrowed from the Exim Bank of Taiwan up to $400 million in 4 years. US dollars, Mr. Speaker, to the best of my recollection. Is that US? Mr. Speaker, I stand corrected, Mr. Speaker. 400 million EC dollars in 4 years. Mr. Speaker, COVID is now the panacea for everything in St. Lucia. And I must admit that I even get confused at times, just going through government literature, trying to understand the handling of COVID. We first heard of a COVID-19 emergency loan. This was followed by a COVID-19 response project, then a COVID-19 rapid credit facility, then a COVID-19 relief program, Our COVID-19 response program, and the list goes on and on and on. And I must admit, Mr. Speaker, that I am finding it extremely difficult to understand or find a way to reconcile all these line items as government expenditure in response to the challenges that COVID would have brought before us. Mr. Speaker, borrowing can have a very debilitating effect on the economy. And notwithstanding all the back and forth, forget ascribing blame to this side or that side. The one thing that remains a constant and factual here today is that when a country borrows and you are not in a position where you can control your borrowing, Mr. Speaker, this can have catastrophic consequences for a country moving forward. And the debt to GDP ratio is a very good indicator of how we are supposed to proceed. Mr. Speaker, we did not see COVID. We didn't know COVID was coming. And as I said, COVID has posed challenges. But the one thing it has done is that it has forced, and I made the point here before, it has forced governments back to the drawing board to reevaluate and re-examine their priorities. And we're saying today, yes, there are challenges. Yes, people have been displaced. Thousands of people have lost their jobs in the tourism sector. Farmers have been affected. Bus drivers, fishers. No sector of this country or our economy has been spared. But we say, Mr. Speaker, and it's a caution that we must raise, that moving forward, borrowing money is something that we have to watch very closely, Mr. Speaker. The debt to GDP ratio as it stands, to my understanding, Mr. Speaker, is somewhere in the region of 90 to 95%. What does that mean to the average person who sits at home and watches NTN listening to the debates in the parliament? What do they make or understand? What do they derive from debt to GDP ratio? Hovering somewhere between 90 to 95%. What it means, Mr. Speaker, in very lay and simple language, is that for every dollar that the government would raise or the government would make, to use everyday language, between 90 to 95 cents, Mr. Speaker, of that amount is already owed to lending institutions. And so you are left with somewhere in the region of 10 to 5 cents to build roads, schools, refurbish police stations, fire stations, pay salaries to public servants, provide laptop computers to the children of this country, and to fix health centers. So the government doesn't have much space to maneuver. And when you are confronted with a debt to GDP ratio that is not favorable for development, Mr. Speaker, everybody is impacted. I recall my days in the classroom, and when St. Lucia was going through an OECS education reform project, the World Bank as a lending institution financing those programs were saying that St. Lucia had a situation where the teacher-student ratio was not acceptable. And it didn't matter to them at the time that we had children of different ages belonging to different grades. All they were concerned about is that you should have had a ratio of one child to somewhere about one teacher, to every 45 or so students you had in the school system. But when you have the autonomy and the flexibility, because you've managed your economy well and you've controlled your debt portfolio in a manner that is favorable, Mr. Speaker, it gives you greater latitude for better decision making that will be down to the benefit of all your citizens. So when we come here and we say that the government must borrow responsibly in November 2020, your retort cannot be the seabed. Your retort cannot be jobs, jobs, jobs. Your retort cannot be those things that are passé. And we've been told that COVID calls for a national effort. But today, Mr. Speaker, I can state categorically that I do not believe this government actually means it when it says that COVID calls for a national effort. The contributions of the opposition are never appreciated and valued for what they are. And the only time there will be engagement of opposition members in relation to COVID is when it will make the government look good. For the optics. Let's build a new St. Lucia. Let's move forward together. We just heard recently, Mr. Speaker, that the government will be hiring COVID wardens. Who selected or sent forward the names? I have seen what COVID can do to destabilize the psyche of a people at the level of constituency. And I have never, Mr. Speaker, not for once, did I shy away when the call was put through to me as the parliamentary rep. I've worked with people from the Bureau of Health Education. I've worked with personnel from the Office of the Chief Medical Officer. I have responded to calls from the Prime Minister. I have assisted the nurses in the community that I represent in this parliament. But tomorrow, we'll hear about an enforcement issue. Names have been, or people have been recruited, from what I was told, or names have been selected or chosen. And the names have been sent or have been sent to the Office of the Prime Minister for verification. That is what I heard from the Deputy Commissioner of Police in an interview on television a few days ago. Mr. Speaker, if COVID calls for a national effort, are you saying to me that given all the talk about the back door, given all the destabilization and the stigmatization in Denver North, that I could not have recommended 1, 2, or 3 persons to be wardens? I could not have done that, Mr. Speaker. But tomorrow and today and later, Mr. Speaker, COVID will be a national crisis that calls for a national effort, and there must be buy-in from everybody. Mr. Speaker, I have absolutely no issues with wardens. But today I want to caution that we have to be very, very careful how we go about appointing and discharging the wardens into community. I believe, notwithstanding all what we've seen, that there is still a case that can be made for moral suasion. The last thing you would want, Mr. Speaker, is for wardens to be clashing with citizens in every pocket of this country. And whether we like it or not, there are persons today who are still petrified about the possibilities of COVID infiltrating their homes. And for those who have taken it for granted and who couldn't care less, when the official report came out and it was said to this country that we've had 2 COVID fatalities, Mr. Speaker, persons who took it for granted started taking it very, very seriously. I got phone calls. People came to my office and asking me how serious I think this is. So, Mr. Speaker, it is a very serious situation that we have on our hands. But if we are convinced that it is a national crisis that calls for all hands to be on deck, I believe the opposition can be engaged in ways that are more meaningful than what we see. You cannot speak about us disparagingly 1 minute, and then tomorrow when it is convenient for the sound bites to make the rounds through the media, you begin to speak as if you are all embracing and there's a place for everybody at the discussion table. Mr. Speaker, we saw the setting up of a command center. If COVID calls for a national effort, provisions should have been made for the leader of the opposition to have had a representative on this command center. The Prime Minister said it at the last sitting, that in community mobilization, we need all leaders to play their role. And he even made a case for candidates who are not even contested elections. And he said that they had a role to mobilize. He said it right here. And if that is the case, Mr. Speaker, you're telling me that you're going to have a command center that is so broad-based in its composition, but yet you could not find a place for the leader of the opposition or a representative from the opposition? But we're building a new St. Lucia. Mr. Speaker, this is an administration that pushes the line, do as I say and not as I do. Police officers are charging people and taking people to task in the streets of the city for not wearing masks. And we will never condone people not wearing masks. We believe that people ought to wear the mask and follow all the protocols established by the chief medical officer. But you cannot be harassing people, not at their right, for not wearing a mask. And on social media, you have the Prime Minister dancing Western. Literally, a mask. What message are we sending here, Mr. Speaker? We cannot. So, Mr. Speaker, I don't think Mr. Speaker would allow Luli to resonate in Hansard. But, Mr. Speaker, on a very serious note, Mr. Speaker, I believe that the government needs.
So you were not serious, honorable member?
About Luli? But, Mr. Speaker, on a very, very serious note, I believe that there is need for greater participation or for allowances to be made for there to be greater participation of the opposition moving forward. I have said, Mr. Speaker, that we have to borrow responsibly. And today, as I said, we don't know COVID would have been on our doorsteps. So it is not a case as to who managed or mismanaged. Where we are at today calls for all hands to be on deck. And if we do not watch our borrowing, Mr. Speaker, when the debt to GDP ratio begins to create problems for us, every St. Lucian will be affected one way or another. Mr. Speaker, I want to profit the opportunity to start off with my constituents and ask them to follow all the protocols established by the Office of the Chief Medical Officer. I want to encourage all St. Lucians to take the protocols seriously. Whether we like it or not, Mr. Speaker, the spiraling numbers have consequences for all of us. And as I said previously, the consequences can be twofold. They can be of a health nature, or they can create problems for us where people get the perception that we are a high-risk destination and they will not come here. I heard the member for Ancillary earlier this morning, Mr. Speaker, trying to make light of the suggestion that there should be a second test done. And he tried to make it seem as if the second test was being proposed or being encouraged to allow people to roam freely, or words to that effect. The only reason why the St. Lucia Labour Party or the opposition, we were calling for the second test, was to give the people of St. Lucia the assurance that visitors coming to our country were not the ones bringing in COVID. It was not to prove any point. It was not to advance any business objective for persons who probably have facilities for testing. There is apprehension in the society. Lani moun ki ni a Perez, ek nou ka dis, lò fè test la an deuxième fois. Sel wezon nou ka mande pou test la, so that results la kay mouche nou, ou di nou, et c'est moun ki ka veni aéroport ki ka mene COVID. Ebe si se pa yo. But what has been said about the back door? My community or constituency has been stigmatized. I recall getting that phone call from the Prime Minister the Saturday morning. And among the things being considered, Mr. Speaker, was to cordon off the Olio community because we were potential super spreaders, if I should use a word I heard coming from across the table this morning. But since then, how many people from Denmark or Olio have tested positive? But in other parts of the country, where the number has shot up exponentially, you do not hear about cordoning off any community. There's no stigmatization. And so, Mr. Speaker, people will be concerned. And the worst thing that can happen to us in the management of COVID moving forward is for the public to lose confidence and trust in the authorities responsible for the management of COVID. And that is why there must be buy-in. Government, opposition, civil society organizations. Nous pas ça faire bako nous. Et si nous pas aller commune nous et puis 10 moun that le gouvernement dit yo pour on ne peut pas y la vérité. Le gouvernement qui a fait tout ça, en les contre le Mr. Speaker. Moun qui a fait ça, il voulait, et ça a fait une situation plus difficile, by Jean Saint-Lucie, et puis qui a fait plus difficile pour nous en pays. I want to see a solution, Mr. Speaker, where we manage COVID effectively. Where the cases, if not disappear, will be reduced to a very, very low minimum. But it cannot be achieved if contributions from entities or groupings or stakeholders like the parliamentary opposition cannot be valued for what those contributions are. This, Mr. Speaker, is my very short presentation on the resolution that is before us. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.